This is a GCSE presentation looking at the rate of photosynthesis. Use the information above to describe the ways that you could measure how fast photosynthesis is occurring. So you should know the equation above is the chemical equation for photosynthesis, in which carbon dioxide and water are turned into oxygen and glucose. All you're being asked now is methods that you could use to work out how quickly that particular reaction is occurring. Pause the presentation, have a think of some answers and restart when you're ready. Pause the presentation now. There are a number of different methods that you may have come up with in order to work out the rate of photosynthesis, but the simplest ones will link to how much carbon dioxide or how much water is being used, or how much glucose or how much oxygen is being produced. The faster the chemical reaction, the faster we will use up the reactants, and the faster the chemical reaction, the faster we will make the products. So if we measure how much something is being used or how much something is being produced, we can get an indication of the rate of the chemical process of photosynthesis. In this session, we're going to cover ways that we can actually measure that rate, and we're going to look at how we can change that rate. 4 different factors that can change the rate of photosynthesis. At this point, I want you to pause the presentation, think of what the answer might be using the pictures, and when you're ready, you can restart the presentation. If you're struggling, you can, of course, go straight through the presentation, get the information, memorize it, and then try it again later on, see if you can still remember the answers. So pause the presentation now, restart whenever you want the answers. So in this question, we're asking for describe. So we're really only saying what. So in this case, we have light intensity. By increasing the light intensity, we increase the rate of photosynthesis. We haven't said anything about why it happens. We're just saying what happens. The second one, the picture represents carbon dioxide concentration. Remember, you need that word concentration in there. And again, increasing the carbon dioxide concentration increases the rate of photosynthesis. The third one is the amount of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the green chemical found inside chloroplasts. And remember, chloroplasts are found inside plant cells. With an increased amount of chlorophyll, we have an increase in the rate of photosynthesis. And lastly, we have the temperature. And if we increase the temperature, we increase the rate of photosynthesis. So there's 4 ways that we can affect the rate of photosynthesis. So in this particular question, we're not just having to say what happens, we've got to say why it happens. So why each factor will affect the rate of photosynthesis. We've already mentioned previously what the 4 factors were, but at this point, pause the presentation and try and identify why each of these things can affect the rate of photosynthesis. And when you're ready, you can restart the presentation to go through the answers. So pause the presentation now. The first of the factors is light intensity. And in terms of light intensity is a measure of sunlight energy. And sunlight energy is needed for photosynthesis. So the higher the light intensity, it means we've got more sunlight energy, so we have faster photosynthesis. And we're explaining why the light intensity affects photosynthesis. In the second example, we're looking at carbon dioxide concentration. Again, carbon dioxide is needed for photosynthesis. The higher the concentration of carbon dioxide, the higher the rate of photosynthesis. In terms of chlorophyll, well, chlorophyll is stored within chloroplasts, which absorbs sunlight energy for photosynthesis. So the more chlorophyll we have, the more sunlight energy that can be absorbed, and so the faster the rate of photosynthesis. And the last factor is temperature. And this temperature one's a little bit tricky because there's actually 2 parts to this. The first part we say is that if we increase the temperature, there are more collisions and the speed of the enzyme reactions in photosynthesis happen faster. Increased temperature, increased speed in the reaction because there's more collisions between the enzyme and substrate. However, there is a temperature at which we have too high, and when we get to that temperature that's too high, what happens is that the enzymes are denatured. If the enzymes are denatured, they stop working and photosynthesis stops. So increasing temperature is a good thing up until we hit that high temperature, and if we get too high a temperature, we'll actually stop photosynthesis altogether. So that fourth one's a little bit more complicated. In terms of calculating rate, you may be asked for about 2 marks how to calculate the rate of photosynthesis for a particular value. So at 20 degrees, what was the rate of photosynthesis? Something like that. And all you have to do is you've got to take the amount of reactant or the amount of product. Now be careful, we use the word amount in this equation because depending on what question you're using, you could be talking about a solid, a liquid, or a gas. So you really should talk about the mass if it's a solid rather than amount, or the volume if it's a liquid or a gas. We very rarely use the word amount at GCSE. So in a chemical reaction and photosynthesis, we get the amount of reactant that has been used and we divide it by the amount of time it took for that reactant to be used up. Or we take the amount of product that we created and we divide that by the amount of time it took for that product to be created. So we get the amount of gas made per minute, per second, or per hour, depending on what our units are. There is another way of doing it, which involves the use of a graph, and we simply work out how steep the graph is. We do that by working out the difference in 2 points on the y-axis and dividing that by the difference on the same 2 points along the x-axis. One of the things they might ask you to do in the exam is they might ask you to draw a graph using data that they provide you in a table. In front of you, you've been given that sort of question where you've been given lines for the graph, but there is information and data missing. What I'd like you to do is either in your head or on paper you can draw out a sketch of what the graph would look like. You do not have to do graph paper or anything like that, but you're of course welcome to. And I want you to make an idea of what would you include if you had to draw that graph in the exam. What information, what data would you put in there? When you're ready, you can go on and check the answers, but I'll give you a bit of time, pause the presentation now. When you're drawing the graph, things that you need to remember, you must copy the label, the heading from the results table, and you must copy the units from the results table. If you don't copy every letter, every symbol, every bracket, every dash, every number, everything must be copied identical onto the graph for the labels and units. You must also start at 0. The bottom left corner should always have a 0 on the y-axis, a 0 on the x-axis, and then your numbers can go up in equal amounts. Each of your lines, now you're lucky in this question because the lines were already drawn for you, but when you're putting numbers along the x-axis, numbers along the y-axis, they must be equally spaced out, and they must also go up by the same amount. So you can't have 0, 5, 26, 2.5, they can't jump. It has to be 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. They must always go up by the same amount and must always be equally spaced out when you're writing your numbers onto the labels. Another thing they might ask you to do in the exam in terms of photosynthesis is they may ask you to get information and start talking about information relating to a particular graph and this idea of limiting factors. To get started, I've given you a graph similar to what you'd see in the exam, and all I want you to do is describe the graph. Literally, what's happening in that graph. Remember, we don't need to explain why it's happening, we've just got to say what's happening. Pause the presentation now, give yourself a chance to answer the question. When you're ready, you can restart the presentation. So pause it now. when you're looking at the graph, in order to give you an answer, they have put point A, point B, and point C on that particular graph. So in your description, you should be talking about point A, point B, and point C. And quite clearly, between point A and point B, the line goes up. Between C and D, it levels off and becomes horizontal. Do not use the word plateau. We only say the word level off. Between A and B, increasing factor X increases the rate. Between B and C, there is a constant rate. The rate doesn't change no matter what we do with X. Now we've got to explain the graph. We can't just say what's happened, we have to say why it's happened. Again, pause the presentation, come up with your best answer, and when you're ready, you can restart the presentation. So now we've got to explain the graph. When you're explaining, sometimes it's helpful to say what's happening first and then explain why it's happening. Well, if we look between A and B, as we increase factor X, the rate goes up. There we are describing. To explain it, we have to say why. And the reason why is because factor X is called the limiting factor. And the reason it's the limiting factor is because it is, of the 4 factors that can affect the rate of photosynthesis, it is the one in the lowest amount. Between B and C, we have increased factor X to such a high point that we've lots and lots of it now, which means we have run out of one of the other 3 factors that can affect the rate of photosynthesis. So for example, if factor X was carbon dioxide concentration, between A and B, we have lots of everything else, but a limited amount of carbon dioxide concentration. Hence, between A and B, we say that the carbon dioxide concentration would be the limiting factor if it was factor X. Between B and C, we have put a lot of carbon dioxide concentration in there, made it really high, which means that we have run out of something else. For example, the sunlight intensity may not be high enough. Last thing I'd like you to do is make a list of all the things you've learned from the lesson, and once you've got a list, I'd like you to put them in order of most important to least important.